What do you think about that? That is some Cherokee Native American music. Did you like it? I enjoy that. I think it's beautiful. It's something that is native to Tennessee. The Cherokees were here long before the settlers started coming. The same settlers from the 13 colonies crossed the proclamation line of 1763 across the mountains into Tennessee. When they came across the mountains, the Cherokee were already here. That's some Cherokee music. And I started our lesson this week with you because our story is about Native Americans. Let me shrink myself so we can see these words. Our story is about Native Americans this week, and it's called The Game of Silence. So I'm anxious to read this story with you today and see what this story is all about. I've not read it yet, so we'll be reading it together for the first time today. But I wanted to get your mind kind of focused on Native Americans with that music today. And I just found it on YouTube. You can type in Cherokee music if you enjoyed it and listen to some more. You might even find some of them doing rain dances and different kind of dances. It's very interesting. And so that might be something fun you can do in your spare time today. Well, as always, we need to go ahead and get started with our vocabulary for the story this week. Some words that we'll see in our story all week long. And of course, some words that we'll be tested on also. So let's take a look at these first few words here. This first one is absurd. Absurd. Have you ever heard anybody say that? That's just absurd. If something is absurd, you think it's silly or ridiculous. We laughed and laughed at the absurd idea. So absurd is silly. It's just something you thought that's silly or ridiculous. And what if, let's see, what would be absurd? It's going to be an election soon. What if somebody said, I think Mr. Helton is going to be the president? Well, that's absurd. That's ridiculous because I'm not running for president and I wouldn't want to be president. That's absurd. This word, this is an odd looking word, isn't it? Taunt. It's taunt. This is that sound here, schwa sound, A-U. Taunt. A taunt is something someone says to anger or upset someone else. After the first taunt, I learned to cover my ears. So sometimes when I used to play football, we call it smack talk. Be like, I'm going to whoop you. I'm going to knock you down. You know, you taunt somebody. You kind of threaten them. Something you would say to somebody to anger them or upset them. It's a taunt. You taunt them. So it's kind of like saying something mean to somebody to get them upset. Forfeit. Forfeit. Have you ever had to forfeit a game if you play sports? If you forfeit something, you lose it because you've broken a rule. Sometimes teams have to forfeit. When I played softball, we might have to forfeit a game if not enough players showed up to play. We broke the rule. We didn't have enough players to play. If you trip your opponent, you forfeit the game. So it's like a penalty. You forfeit something, you lose it because you've broken a rule. Despised. Despised. If you despise something, you felt a strong dislike for it. You might even say this is a synonym for hate. I can't stand it. I despise it. I hate it. I have always despised the color red. I like the color red, don't you? But to despise something is to really dislike it. Look at this word. Can you sound this out with me? F-E-R, fur, O, and then that C-I-O-U-S always says shus. Ferocious. You've heard that word, haven't you? Ferocious. Something that is ferocious is very fierce, mean, and violent. The grizzly bear is the most ferocious animal I know. I saw a video. Did you see that? There was a cabin in the woods somewhere. I didn't see where it was, but it had like a doorbell camera, not a doorbell camera, but an alarm camera inside, and someone was banging on the door, and the door flew off the hinges, and it was a grizzly bear, knocked their wooden door down. They weren't home, thank goodness, but it came right into their house. It was a ferocious grizzly bear. A couple more words here. Look at this one. Let's sound it out. Elaborately. If something is elaborately dressed or decorated, it has many complex artistic details. Some of you might be dressed elaborately for Halloween. You might have a lot of details to your costume. The bowl was elaborately decorated with scenes of everyday life. So elaborately means very, very fancily dressed or very fancily decorated. A lot of details to it. This last word, coveted. If you coveted something, you wanted it very much. You coveted it. It means you really, really wanted it more than anything else in the world. I coveted that bike. So there's our words for this week. We'll review them again tomorrow. But absurd, taunt, forfeit, despised, ferocious, elaborately, and coveted. Let's take a look at another tool we can use as we read a story. And this tool is visualize. And that is using your senses to create pictures in your mind as you read. I like to do that. Have you ever been reading a story and just got so lost in it that it feels like you were there? It feels like you weren't even in real life. Yeah, I've done that before. Sometimes when we read The Witches, I feel that way. It feels like you're there in the story. And some things that we can do, or questions we could ask, I should say, as we visualize as we read a story, we can ask these questions. What do I see in my mind? Sometimes the story has pictures and sometimes it doesn't. So when you're reading a story, if a good author will create images in your mind, you're able to visualize what the author is writing about. What would I smell? You know, if your story's talking about something cooking or maybe a forest or a bed of flowers, sometimes it makes us smell things. What would you smell if you were there if you're visualizing the story? What kind of things would I hear if I was this character in the story? What would I taste and what would I feel? So using our five senses, we use our five senses: see, smell, hear, taste, touch, when we visualize. But we just do it in our mind as if we were in the story. We're going to come back to this after we read our story in a minute and talk about what kind of things the story calls us to visualize as we read it. Let's meet the author of our story. And we don't have a picture, but the author's name is Louise Erdrich. Louise Erdrich. She was born in 1954 in Little Falls, Minnesota. Her father is German American, and her mother is half French American and half Ojibwe. Ojibwe is a Native American tribe that was Indians in America. The tribe written about in The Game of Silence is the Ojibwe. So the tribe we're going to read about is the same tribe that her mother is half part of. She is also a member of the Anishinaabe Nation. She's written novels, children's books, and poetry, focusing on her Native American heritage. So this author likes to write about her heritage. That's one of our vocabulary words from a few weeks ago. And she likes to write stories and poetry, focusing on her heritage as a Native American. I bet some of you have Native American heritage, some Cherokee in your family. Miss Erdrich writes about historical and modern day issues faced by Native Americans. She currently lives in Minnesota with her children. She continues to write and also owns a small bookstore that specializes in Native American writing and art. I would like to go to her bookstore, wouldn't you? Have you ever been to Cherokee, North Carolina? If you've not, it would be a great little trip this fall because you could drive through the mountains and see the really beautiful colors on the trees. But Cherokee, North Carolina is just maybe an hour from Gatlinburg, not too far. And over there is where the Cherokee Indians have a reservation where their tribe lives today. And there's all kinds of shops with Native American art in it. And there's even a show over there called Unto These Hills about the history of the Cherokee Indians. It is so cool. It's an outdoor theater. It might be something fun to do with your family. But We have a lot of Native American culture around us as well, just like this author has Native American culture in her family. Let's go ahead and get ready to read our story. Again, this story is called The Game of Silence. And this story's genre, or the type of story it is historical fiction. So historical is kind of like social studies, right? History, and fiction means it's not a real story. So what is historical fiction? It's a story that's set in a real time and place in the past. So it's a story that's made up, but it takes place in a real time in the past of the history of our country or some other country. Historical fiction includes characters who would act, think, and speak like real people from the past would. Authors of historical fiction tell the story through the plot or the main events of the story. We're going to go and review what plot is again this week. Authors of historical fiction may use figurative language to develop the setting and the characters. I know you worked on figurative language last week, didn't you? You even took a quiz on figurative language, so hopefully you're getting used to some words like similes and metaphors and personification and alliteration, and those words we looked at in figurative language. All right, let's just take a look at the picture. What does it reveal about the characters, and what do you want to learn about the characters? Let's take a look. Well, as I look at this picture, I see two very different characters. This character looks mad about something, doesn't? I think it's a she. I'm not sure, though. This person looks very, very mad about something or upset. But this person looks like they don't care. They're just having a good time. So it makes me wonder, who is this person? Are they siblings? Are they brother or sister or two sisters? And I look in the background here and I see these odd-looking houses. It doesn't look like a teepee that I've seen before. So I wonder what kind of houses these are. And I also wonder, why is this called The Game of Silence? I guess we're about to find out. Let's read this story together now. And this story is in your reading book beginning on page 142. So please get your reading book out. You can pause the video if you want to for a minute till you get it. And page 142 is where we're going to be reading together. I want you to read along with me in your reading book. Here we go. Omakayas is an Ojibwe girl who lives with her family on Lake Superior. It is 1850, and members of a neighboring tribe have just recently arrived after being forced from their land. They've traveled a long way, and they are tired, hungry, and raggedy. Omakayas and her brother are at home with their godmother. Oh, one second. Okay. They're at home with their grandmother, Nokomis. They begin to play a silent game while they wait for others to arrive so the adults can discuss what is happening to their people. So let's read down here. Words, 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 pressing up from her stomach, trembling on her lips, words buzzing in her throat like caught bees, banging in her head, harsh words, angry words, sounds boiling up in her like sap. Wild things she couldn't let out. Wow. Have you ever had words that felt like that? Like bees buzzing? Yow. A kick from her brother almost caused Omakayas to blurt an exclamation. No, Omakayas sealed her lips together in a firm line and glared at her brother with all the force pent up inside. If the fire from her eyes could scorch him, Pinch would be the first to yell out. Then he would lose the game of silence. But Pinch was used to receiving furious looks from his family. He knew just how to respond. First, he looked as innocently as Omakayas, as though he was ever innocent. He pretended he was unaware of the raging energy stuffed up inside of his sister. Then, as Omakayas bored her eyes at him with increasing intensity, he lulled out his tongue and twisted his face into a deranged and awful mask. His features shifted into one ugly and absurd, or ridiculous face after the next, until one ugly and absurd face after the next, until suddenly Omakayas just about, almost laughed. Just in time, she clapped her hand to her mouth, closed her eyes, concentrated. Yes, Aya. She would be a stone. Asanig, a pile of stones. Each one harder and quieter than the next. She would be silent and more silent yet. And in spite of her annoying brother, she would win. She kept her eyes closed, put her forehead on her knees, thought stone, stone, stone. Asin, Asin. Filled her mind with the sound of falling rain, which was easy. Outside, it was not just raining, but pouring down, a drenching, cold, miserable early summer shower. So we see here, Iya, or Iya means yes. Asinig is a pile of stones, and Asin is one stone. Look at them there. So now we know who those two people were. We've got the girl and her wild brother, and they're playing a game of silence. Have you ever done that? Maybe you've seen who would blink first. I guess they're trying to see who would talk first. The rain had lasted for days since the raggedy ones arrived. There was another thing. Besides Pinch, Omachias couldn't stand rain anymore. The water made mush of tender new ground around her family's birch bark house. Droplets hissed through the roof vent into the fire, driving stinging smoke into her eyes. Everyone around her was affected. Nakomi's old bones ached, and she creaked like a tree every time she moved. The watery winds sent coughs racking through her mother's chest. It was too wet to play outside, and cold when it should have been warm. Worst of all, Omachias was stuck with Pinch. He nudged her. Omachias almost slugged him in return, but she controlled herself. She'd had enough of him to last her whole life. She opened her eyes a fraction, and then her eyes went wide in shock. Somehow, Pinch had got hold of her beloved doll, and he was making it teeter off the cliff of his knees. Omachias bit her lip so hard it hurt. Pinch walked her doll to the edge of her knees and then teasingly back. If only Mama was here. If only she would return. Nakomi's concentrated on her work so hard it was impossible to distract her. Omachias pretended to shut her eyes again, but cleverly watched until just the right moment to snatch back her doll. She sighed as though she was falling asleep, and then with a flash, she grabbed. Taken by surprise, Pinch couldn't react enough to hold on, and Omachias triumphantly clutched her doll. She stuck it down the neck of her dress. There, safe, inside, she laughed, but she didn't make a single sound. Not a chirp, not so much as a mouse's squeak. Do you have a little brother or little sister that's ever got on your nerves like Pinch is getting on Omachias' nerves? I think they're fighting siblings, don't you? She was going to win this game of silence. She just knew it. Pinch was now poking little twigs into the fire in the center fire pit, watching them burn. Omachias tried not to notice him, but his head was so big and fuzzy. Pinch's hair sprang out with its own energy. Crafty eyes and his rough, round face calculated his sister's endurance. He was surely cooking up some mischief. Sure enough, Pinch drew the burning wand from the fire and laid it innocently next to her ankle, as though she didn't know that it would scorch her if she moved the slightest inch, and make her cry out first and instantly lose the game. She kicked it back at him. "Gego, Pinch," she nearly warned, but bit her lip. What Gego means, stop that. "Ea, ea, ea," he mouthed the taunt, making an impossibly irritating face that almost broke Omachias' discipline. Luckily, just at the second that Omachias decided to forfeit the game and to smash her little brother over the head with a big tin soup ladle, the visitors arrived. "They are here," said the grandmother. "You can quit the game until after we eat." So here's the visitors. They don't look real happy. She doesn't look real happy, does she? There's her doll. There's his stick he was trying to get to burn her. This must be grandmother, and here's the visitors. Looks pretty spacious inside this house, doesn't it? "Ah!" Omachias exploded with such a wild sound of rage that Nokomis jumped. Pinch retreated, unnerved by how sorely he'd tested his sister. Omachias breathed out in relief. These visitors were her friends and cousins, Twilight, Little Bee, and Two Strike Girl. They had brought the boy she called in her mind the Angry One. Her cousins were her favorite friends, the one she counted on. Twilight was much like her name, quiet and thoughtful. Little Bee was funny and bold. Two Strike was tough, and she could do anything a boy could do, usually better. Since her mother had died, she was wilder than ever. Even her father had not been able to handle Two Strike and had left her with Auntie Muskrat. But Auntie Muskrat had had no success in taming Two Strike. Sometimes she was so fierce that she outdid everyone. It was a challenge to play with her. The girls had learned how to sew and bead together, gather berries, and help their mothers clean fish. They also learned early on how to tan hides, a task that Omachias despised. She didn't like it, did she? And now, too, her sister, Angeline, was home. Omachias grinned with satisfaction. Pinch was delightfully outnumbered by girls and would pout, creeping to Mama's side when she arrived and turning into a baby, hoping to be pampered with tidbits of meat and maple sugar. Yeah, now Omachias her expression has changed, hasn't it? Now she looks happy because her cousins, her best friends, are there. The ones she counted on, she said. Now everyone, the children and their parents, squeezed into the lodge. They had made the lodge extra big that summer for visitors. For the first time, it was packed entirely full, but there was enough room for everyone. Even the angry one found a space to sit. He glared from a little spot against the wall. Together they ate rich venison soup from the shallow birch bark macacoon they'd brought with them. The two other men squeezed in, important men. Old Tallow entered, huge and rangy and smelling of wolf. She settled herself while outside her ferocious dogs stood guard, unmoving and alert even in the pelting rain. Each of Old Tallow's feet seemed to take up as much space as a small child, but Omachias didn't mind. Warily, but completely, she loved the fierce old woman. So here's some of the things that she's got on the floor there. What do you see? Like a bow and arrow, some marbles, her doll, her shoes, some kind of little bells, a knife of some kind, and some ribbon. Each visitor brought a gift for the pile that the children who won the game of silence would choose from that night, for it was an important night. With the raggedy ones came serious doings, difficult questions, and impossible news. Great attention was needed. The grown-ups needed to counsel, think, absorb the facts without having to shush small children. The children could tell how important the meeting was from the degree to which the silence was required. The pile of treats was the best ever. There was a bag of marbles, some of actual glass, not just clay, a pair of narrow Mackenzanan that Omachias thought just might fit her, one doll elaborately dressed in a tiny set of breeches and a leather coat, a sharp knife, a deer knuckle game, 2 duck's bills of maple sugar tied together with split jack pine root, 6 red ribbons, a little doll of flowered cloth, 8 tiny bells, 1 small bow, and 6 arrows tipped with real brass points cut from a trade kettle. The arrows were fletched with the sharp black and yellow yellow feathers of a bird that the island where they lived was named for, the golden-breasted woodpecker. Old Tallow must have brought them. What treasures! The children examined them breathlessly, each picking out one particular size they meant to win. So we're starting to find out now why that they are having to be quiet, aren't we? It's because they've been told to be quiet. It's a game because the adults are having a very important meeting. And I guess the quietest one gets to pick from the pile there. Little Bee, of course, wanted the doll. Two Strike Girl, the bow and arrows. Pinch coveted the knife, but he was torn by greed for the maple sugar and the need for marbles to replace those he'd lost. The angry one did not deign to move from his spot or look at the gifts. No doubt he'd have no problem winning the game. As for Twilight, quiet and serene, she had no trouble playing the game, and she would be content with anything. Omachias wanted the ribbon, the bells, and the marbles too, but she settled on the Mackenzanan because she had watched her grandmother make them so carefully. They were fancy, with velvet ankle cuffs, the tops beaded with flowers and little white sparkling vines, worth her silence. So I think she wants those shoes. Now the grown-ups were ready to start talking. Nokomis sang the song of the game of silence 4 times, nearly catching Pinch at the end. Then she turned away from them too, absorbed in the talk. Omikias looked longingly at Twilight, and her cousin made a sad and frustrated face. With her favorite cousin so close and annoying brothers so near, it was difficult to play. If only they could talk. At first, the girls communicated by mouthing words and moving their eyes, but the temptation to laugh was too great. They turned away from each other unwillingly. Omikias listened to the rain, a solid drumming and hissing. Then she listened to the fire crackling and sighing. She watched the beautiful and changing glow of the coals. At some point, Omikias couldn't tell exactly when, her attention was caught by something her father said. And then she noticed that her cousin Twilight was also listening to the grown-ups' conversation. Soon they all couldn't help but listen. They leaned forward, straining to hear every sound, almost forgetting to breathe. What do you think the adults are talking about? All the kids are listening now. Maybe we'll find out. That night, for the first time, everybody got their prizes. Nobody lost the game of silence. For that night, they knew the threat of a much bigger loss. They would all fear to lose something huge, something so important that they never even knew they had it in the first place. Who questions the earth, the ground beneath your feet? They had always accepted it, always here, always solid. That something was home. Wow. And that's how the story ends? What do you think about it? What were they scared of losing? Their home. We've learned a little bit about that in social studies, haven't we? As the settlers start moving west, what do they do to the Indians' land? They take it away, don't they? Yes, they take away the Indians' land. So I guess maybe some settlers are moving onto their land, and the adults are talking about, are we going to have to fight for it, or are we just going to move? Wow, it's a different twist to our story for sure. Let's look through some of these questions together. What does Omikias do to help her stay silent? Well, I remember she listens to the rain. She looks at the fire, watch the coals change color in the fire, listens to the rain fall into the fire and hiss. She wasn't going to lose, was she? Who plays the game of silence, and why is the game being played? Well, we read that all the children had to play the game of silence, and they were playing it because the adults had a very serious conversation they had to have, and they didn't, as the story said, they didn't want to have to hush children and interrupt their conversation. What details show that the night is important to Omikias and her family? Well, they had visitors. They'd made their house extra large. They had some kind of stew, didn't they? Everybody brought gifts for the pile for the game of silence. So there was a lot of important things that were happening there. What'd you think of that story? I was enjoying reading it, but it ended quicker than I thought it was going to end. And it sure didn't end the way I thought it was going to end. But I enjoyed reading it, and I look forward to reading it again with you this week. Maybe we can learn some more about it. So let's talk about visualizing. What did you see in your mind as we read the story? I was thinking about the inside of the house there, that little hut they lived in. I was thinking if it would look round on the inside and if it really had as much room as it seemed to in the pictures in the story. What would I smell? There was a fire burning in there, and she talked about the smoke getting in her eyes. And so I was smelling smoke as I was reading the story. What would I hear? Well, the author gave us very clear description that it was raining very hard outside. So in my mind, I was hearing the sound of rain, but also Omikias kept hearing this, talking about the fire crackling. I love the sound of a crackling fire, don't you? So I could hear that in my mind. What would I taste? She talked about that stew, venison stew. I wonder what that would taste like, Native American food. I bet it was delicious. What would I feel? She said it was cold. So could you feel the cold air in the hut? maybe the warmth of the fire. And they were sitting on the ground. And when her little brother had the hot stick, he was going to try to burn her, maybe feel the heat from that. That's what we mean when we visualize the story. So that was a really neat story. I look forward to reading it again with you. If you'd like now, I would like for you to go to the next slide and take a look at our spelling and our decoding skills for the week.